Nice to see everybody who's here live in the flesh. And also, if you come in the flesh, you get sushi. That's one advantage. Okay? And trying to think what other advantages. The other advantages. We're going to give a little an added bonus to whoever comes in the flesh. But we're so happy for whoever is joining also online. And that's wonderful. And it's a perfect way to get going with our pre-Purim festivities, because Purim is about celebrating a rededication to the study of Torah. Once a rabbi of mine pointed out that according to the rabbis, every holiday is about a celebration of Torah or rededication of the study of Torah. And that's true for Purim too. The rabbis tell us that on Purim, unlike at Sinai, where God did all the work, at Purim, it's the people that took the lead. So there's something very powerful and profound about their commitment to Judaism, even in harder conditions, and their commitment to Torah. Just somebody saying, there's a PowerPoint, that's why you see the screen, and I'm in the top right. Maybe at some point I'll stop share, although I'm scared to touch anything, so I probably won't do that. Okay. So what I want to try to do in this series is both to study some primary texts, but also to try to think of it somewhat conceptually. So that's going to be trying to do a few things at once. And if somebody in the audience has any comment or question or needs clarification, please stop me. And if somebody online needs to make a comment, I'll try to take a look from time to time in the chat. Let's get going with this PowerPoint, assuming I can get it to go. Hold on. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So, oh no, but that's here. You're not seeing it there. Sorry, we need to figure out how to get the PowerPoint moving on the slide here. Okay, there we go. Okay, great. So we have here a letter. And it's a letter from the 17th century. Some of you might have seen a snippet of this in one of the blurbs. And I thought it would be nice to produce the letter here. It's a letter from John Selden to Sir Robert Cudden. And we have the date, July 4th, 1629. Those of you who are history buffs know that the 17th century in England is a tumultuous time, right? Its most dramatic moment probably comes in the early 1640s with the regicide, the killing of the king, right? So this is a very turbulent time in the politics in the West, and it's a very transformative time. Often, maybe in the US, we think of the late 18th century as great dramatic transformation, but obviously has seeds and roots already in the 17th century. At least in those days, what happened in England, over time reverberated around the world. And its reverberations, went to the continental Europe and also across the Atlantic to the US, which we're mindful of here in the US. But going back to the 17th century, we have this interesting moment. Obviously, it's a little more interesting to us Hebraeus, or Jews. And I use the term Hebraeus because that was a term that was used at the time. Hebraeus were people who had interest in ancient Hebrew Bible and the ancient Jews, and often they were not Jews themselves. So that's the term Christian Hebraeus. And one of these Christian Hebraeus, if you will, or a parliamentarian who's also an activist, and he was in Parliament, was John Selden. And here he's writing a letter to Robert Cotton. And Robert Cotton also was a member of Parliament. He was also his mentor. Actually, Selden over his lifetime became much more radical than Cotton. Cotton was a royalist, and even though he was in Parliament, like a lot of early members of parliament, he was still loyal to the crown, while Selden, over his lifetime, was more bold in his confrontation with the crown. And we're finding Selden in this letter sitting in prison. And he's sitting in prison, and he ends up spending, I think, around 8 months in prison at this period for all sorts of political agitations. So what do you do when somebody's making a lot of trouble? So today, I don't know, we find different ways, maybe politicians, to put them in the doghouse. In those days, there's something more dramatic. They literally found excuses or pretenses to lock them up. So Selden is locked up, and he writes a letter. And he writes a letter to his mentor, to this other member of parliament, asking him for some reading material now that he has a lot of time sitting in prison. So he says, "Noble sir," Selden's in the top left in your in the image, and Cotton is in the top right. "Your favors are always so great and ready upon all occasions to me that I take upon me the confidence to trouble you in all kinds. So thank you so much for your favors. I have much time here before me, and there is in Westminster Library the Talmud of Babylon in diverse great volumes. If it be a thing to be obtained, I would beseech you to borrow them of Lord Lincoln, and so get me the use of them." I skipped the parentheses. "But I would not be so unmannerly as to ask them if they be in that state that they may not conveniently be lent, the consideration whereof I leave wholly to your favor and judgment. And I am ever your most affectionate and acknowledging friend and servant, J. Selden." It's quite a letter. And when I read this letter, I have a couple of thoughts. One thought I have is just a thought experiment, an uncomfortable one. If you were in prison, right? Well, the first question is, if you were writing a letter, would you be this polite? That's one question I have. But even I think a more interesting question is, what would you ask for your reading material? And how many of us honestly could say that if we had a request for one piece of reading material, we would ask to borrow the Babylonian Talmud? And remember, this is not a Jewish fellow. That just shows what a brilliant scholar of antiquity he was. And he really learned from Robert Cotton. Robert Cotton was an antiquarian, and these brilliant figures knew Greek and Latin and also Hebrew and also Aramaic, and they were curious to read in the original. I see a comment or question, please, and I'll repeat it for those watching. Yes.
They're not talking about the Steinsaltz edition.
They are not talking about the Steinsaltz edition. Good point.
They were able to read.
Yes, these brilliant scholars could read, in the original. There were certain translations of the Talmud into various languages. Obviously, I don't know the exact date offhand of the earliest English, so I'd have to double check that. But these scholars had command of the original. So there's the letter. And you sort of wonder, beyond being an antiquarian, how is this political figure thinking about the Talmud? What is he expecting to find? Again, Selden is not just curious. Over time, he writes several works about rabbinic law and halakha and the thinking of the ancient rabbis, including several volumes on the tractate that I want to look at together, Sanhedrin. He actually writes several volumes. So this is fascinating stuff. We're not going to look at his volumes now. Maybe at some point we'll have opportunity to look at them. But let me just try to, not good. 1 second. Lost my share here. Sorry. Sorry, still having some technical challenges here, but let's see. Let's see if this works. Okay, gonna need an experiment here for a second. Okay. Sorry, just bear with me a minute. We're having just a little technical difficulties. I don't know how to forward on this to make it work. Yep. Just you want you to do it, so I'll see. Go ahead. Like that? Okay, go for it. One second. So going back is this way? Okay. Okay, but they're not, they're seeing that though.
Right, they're seeing that.
That's not this. Okay,
No, it's a little delayed.
it's a little delayed. Okay.
This is what it's for.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. This is actually sophisticated technology, but it's going to take a little time to just figure it out. So I appreciate your patience bearing with me. So here I have a quote from another constitutional scholar, Micklewayne, and he taught, I think, at Cornell University. And he wrote this fascinating work called Constitutionalism, Ancient and Modern. And he makes this interesting comment about the history of the term constitution. So he says the first instance given in the Oxford Dictionary of the use of the word constitution for the whole legal framework of a state is a phrase of Bishop Paul's in 1610, the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Israel, right? That's quite fascinating. We would not expect that to be the first use of the term constitution in in the Oxford Dictionary. When the Oxford Dictionary, that's one of the beautiful things about the dictionary. It cites a term and then it gives you a whole lineage of its usage. And in the context of using it for a legal framework of the state, it again, and now a coincidence, goes back to the early 17th century to people, British thinkers, right, English thinkers and parliamentarians who are trying to envision a different type of rule, right? There's also the time of John Locke, et cetera, right? Where a lot of just the suppositions and the axioms of how governance should happen are being challenged. So here, in trying to think it through, we know, let's say from Federalist Papers, that they looked to ancient Rome and they looked to ancient Greece, but some of us might be less aware that they also looked to the Hebraic Commonwealth or the Commonwealth of Israel. They look to the Bible and elsewhere. There's an excellent work by a current scholar. I'm just slowing down. Oh, okay. There's an excellent work by a current scholar named Eric Nelson, and he's a professor in Harvard's government department. And he wrote a book, which I recommend, called The Hebrew Republic. And in this book, he really takes on the entire sort of grand narrative of early modern political theory and political development of early modern politics. In this work, he argues as follows. It has become commonplace to attribute the rise of modern political thought in the West to a process of secularization, right? That's the classic story. That maybe in ancient times, people believed that their king had certain, cosmic powers, or was a type of demigod or some, the imperial cult. That was sort of ancient way of thinking. And even in medieval times, we know a notion of the divine right of kings, that the king represents God's will on earth. And that was certainly part of, if not the belief, then the mythology of even medieval political thinking or theory. And we usually think that by early modern times, this is abandoned. We reject this. We think part of the French Revolution is a revolt against the ancien regime, which is a revolt against the king and a revolt against the church, and sort of abandoning all these maybe benighted or old-fashioned or religious ways of thinking. And as we became more secularized, we adopted Western political constructs that we know today, constitutional regimes, etc. Argues Nelson, this book begins from the conviction that the traditional story I've just sketched puts things almost exactly backwards. Wow, that's a striking thesis from a current Harvard government professor. He says it's actually backwards. In the 17th century, in the full fervor of the Reformation, political theology re-entered the mainstream of European intellectual life. The Protestant summons to return to the biblical text brought with it incessant appeal to God's constitutional preferences as embodied in Scripture. So if we think of the transformations of the 17th century, right, there are political transformations and also religious transformations. There's a time in Christianity of the schism. This is a time of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, etc. And at least a lot of Protestant thinking is about returning to Scripture, and returning to Scripture not just for, sola scripta, just what's in Scripture, not just for the individual and the individual's faith, but also for the commonwealth. To look at Scripture and to learn from Scripture about the optimal political design. So Nelson's arguing that we would be being superficial or shallow if we thought that the story of political thinking is just a story of secularization. To be sure, it is also a story of secularization. It's also a story of democracy and rights and individualism and rationalism. But at the same time, there's another current. And that other current is the one that looked to the biblical tradition, the rabbinic tradition, to the Judeo-Christian tradition to learn about the best regime, the optimal commonwealth. How is God's will most manifest in a design of a political sovereign construct and constitution? Now, I want to juxtapose the remarks. This is all really by way of introduction. Soon we're going to get to the rabbinic material. But I think the introduction helps frame why some of this is important and worth thinking about. So I want to juxtapose Eric Nelson, Professor Nelson from Harvard's thesis with another important political thinker, Michael Walzer from the Advanced Institute at Princeton. And Michael Walzer is one of the great political theorists of our day, period. But he also happens to be Jewish and is curious about the Jewish tradition. And he's the editor of a wonderful multi-series volume called The Jewish Political Tradition. I recommend both these works if they are new to people. The Hebrew Republic of Eric Nelson, that's a little bit more dense. And The Jewish Political Tradition of Michael Walzer, which is really a collection of primary texts in translation with nice essays framing them. So Walzer in his Jewish Political Tradition points out a very basic point about Jewish political thinking. And he says the following: the association of politics with the state is pervasive in Western thought. Without statehood, sovereignty and coercive power, there doesn't appear to be anything like political agency, nor therefore any point to the standard political question. So right now he's problematizing, how is there such a thing as the Jewish political tradition, at least over the last 2,000 years, right? Prior to 70 CE, there was a Jewish state. Since 1948, there's a Jewish state. But for 2,000 years in the middle, there was no Jewish state. So how can we really have political thinking without a state? Usually you assume political thinking requires a state. Only when you're within a state would you ask the questions, I'm continuing in the fourth line, who are the legitimate and authoritative agents, etc. With regard to Jews, the questions don't arise 1,000 years. There was no sovereign agents, no coercive power, no politics to think about. But, and here's if you couldn't follow my reading, just return with me to the middle of this quote where it's underlined. But politics is pervasive with or without state sovereignty. Jews also remembered their earlier political history and they dreamed of a messianic revival. So there arose a tradition of thought, theological and legal, rather than autonomously political in form, but political in substance nonetheless. So he says it's not true to think that for 2,000 years Jews didn't think about politics. They certainly did, because human beings, like Aristotle say, man is a political animal. And now to return to Walter's quote, politics is pervasive. If Jews have a state, they'll have politics within the form of the state. And if they don't, they'll find other ways to organize themselves as a community, to think about their relationship to the sovereign entity. And also they'll remember their early political history, and they'll dream forward to a messianic future. We might have different ideas of what that messianic future should look like, but we'll think if we had more sovereignty. And of course, now living post 1948, it's less abstract messianism and it's more concrete reality. So there arose a tradition of thought, theological and legal, rather than autonomously political, but political in substance. Its point of departure is always the Hebrew Bible. 4 lines to the bottom, understood as the revealed word of God. But since writers in the diaspora could not recapitulate the experience represented in the text, they were forced into a radical reinterpretation, or better, a series of reinterpretations of its meaning. So let me just summarize what we have so far. This was all by way of introduction. And the introduction I want to give is to say this is an invitation in the next few weeks or in this series to learn more about Jewish political thought. And the reason that's interesting is, it was interesting to those who helped shape modern political thought. In the 17th century, it's not just some quirk that one antiquarian in prison wanted to read really challenging reading material, right? This person was actually one of the shapers of political life, and the shift from royalism to a parliamentary system, which of course is the way we think about politics in the West today. And he thought you had a lot to learn from the Bible and from the Talmud. And he wasn't alone. He was a member of a small group of not just intellectuals, but political actors who assume that there's great wisdom in Rome, in Greece, and also in Jerusalem, in the Jewish tradition or the Judeo-Christian tradition. And then we just looked at 2 contemporary voices, one from Harvard, another from Princeton. So these are leading thinkers who also say that there's a lot in this tradition worth recovering. Eric Nelson, who says, don't think about politics just as a march towards secularism. It's actually much more interesting than that. There was a whole influence of religious tradition in shaping even modern political thinking. And then we have Michael Walzer, who comments on the sort of puzzle of Jewish politics. Why Jewish politics if for 2,000 years there wasn't a Jewish state? And the answer is, well, Jews always found a way, like all human beings, to have some reaction or relationship to their political environment, to find ways to organize as a community, and also to remember back to King David and the Hasmoneans, etc., and to aspire forward towards a messianic future. And over time, of course, that became more a Zionistic future, or in the US, involvement in US governance, etc. So what I want to try to do is to return to these primary texts, but to allow ourselves to get lost in them. Okay, not everything's going to translate one-to-one with a modern doctrine. Let's try to enter into these texts of the rabbis of the Talmud and try to discern from them certain sort of political stances and interrogate them. Are they obvious? Are they imitating Rome? Are they surprising? Are they agitating against popular conventions? Are they really ancient in our eyes, or are they surprisingly modern in certain ways? Okay, so what I'm going to try to do, if I can, let me try to share this. If it, yeah, trying to share this text for a second. Patience, 1 more minute, please. Do I have it here? How do I share this? This is not the PowerPoint at this point.
Fine. What, 35?
Go back. Yeah. That's crucial. Let's go back to that one. I'll do it next. Okay. I'm going to skip one share. It's fine. I have plenty of shares I want to do. So I want to start with a Mishnah, and I just have it here in Hebrew. Actually, in a few slides forward, I have it also in English. So if the Hebrew is a little challenging, don't worry. First of all, I'm going to read and translate. So stay with me. Second, I will bring up the English in a couple of minutes. That will be helpful. This is a Mishnah in the second chapter of Sanhedrin, and that's what I want us to use as our primary text, the second chapter of Sanhedrin. So if anybody wants to read a little ahead for next time, you could find their amazing websites like Sefaria, and Sefaria has the entire Mishnah and the entire Talmud, and you can find both in Hebrew and English, right? We don't have the challenges of 17th century. We can find the translations readily. So I want to look at the second chapter of Sanhedrin. And to be honest, this is a chapter that's less commonly studied in the yeshivot, in the sort of traditional houses of study. But I think it's a very rich chapter and certainly speaks to certain political questions. And I think in ways that are not obvious. And I've been very fascinated with this chapter for years. So I'm excited to share some of my fascination with you. And hopefully you'll agree that there's fascinating things here. So the Mishnah in Sanhedrin in the second chapter begins as follows. Kohen Gadol, the high priest, Dan v'daninoto, he judges and he is judged. I like to be gender neutral here, but a Kohen Gadol was a man, okay? So we're gonna stick with the gender of these texts. So Kohen Gadol judges and is judged. Me'id, he is testifies, or he can, if he knows something relevant, he is eligible and he's also required to testify. And u'me'idin oto, one testifies against the high priest, meaning if he can be judged, there might be the need to bring testimony against him. Okay, in other words, he's subject to ordinary court proceedings. And then it goes on and it says, choletz v'chotzin le'ishto. Okay, suddenly we've shifted from the courts to a totally different halachic domain having to do with levirate marriages. This is a little bit complex, but we know under biblical law, if a married man passes away and he has no children, if he has a living brother, the living brother either marries the sister-in-law or releases the sister-in-law through a procedure called chalitza, okay? So that's what it means, choletz v'chotzin le'ishto, meaning the high priest has to follow halachic ritual, okay? That's what it says so far. And then it continues on other details about what happens if he does want to release, but actually wants to marry the sister-in-law. How does that work? And then in the next paragraphs, which I won't get into right now, it talks about what happens if the high priest loses a relative, right? A member of his nuclear family, let's say. Does he participate in mourning rites? Does he participate in funeral rites, etc.? So it explains how he goes about doing that. And then the third paragraph talks about if he needs to be comforted because he's lost a member of his nuclear family, how is the procedure for comforting a Kohen? So we could look at this and analyze this on two planes. I'm putting the politics for aside. Let's bracket the politics and just look at the text a little bit and think a little bit about the text. And then we'll bring back in certain political queries or questions we might have gradually. So the first thing to ask, does anybody have any reactions to this text?
The second paragraph, you mean?
Any of the paragraphs?
Well, actually, I know someone who went through Hebrew.
Okay.
It turns out her husband died. I don't remember exactly when. This was before my time, but she had to go through actually the release of the. That was the legal part. Yeah.
Okay, there's a comment. I'm just going to ask the comments to be kept a little brief, just these people in YouTube might not have. But thank you. The comment was that somebody knows somebody who went through some of these ceremonies of levirate marriages and releases, which is pretty fascinating. I've actually witnessed it once in my life. It's a rather rare procedure, but it can happen. Interesting. Another comment?
In Israel, they still do chalitza.
And in Israel, the comment is in Israel, some of this stuff still happens.
Yes.
Yes.
I don't understand what the point of this is.
Yeah.
Why should it be just sort of a straightforward? It should be, I mean, is it any different than for a normal? It's different because he's a coin. He's the coin. He's the coin. He's the topical. But in terms of treating the dead or comforting them, why should it be different for him than any other coin?
Yeah, this is an interesting question and comment. All the comments have been interesting, but I want to focus on this for a second. If I understood the thrust of the comment, I know those on YouTube didn't hear it, so I'm going to say it again. The thrust of the comment is that basically, if you look at the high priest, the Mishnah more or less is saying that the high priest is treated like everybody is treated. Is that more or less the substance of your comment? It's a very good comment. In other words, the high priest we're basically being told he can judge, but you don't need to be a high priest to judge. Presumably, any person who's wise enough and is determined enough can judge. Just 1 second. He is judged. Well, we expect that, today we call that the rule of law, but the rule of halakha, every person can be judged. He testifies, testimonies against him, and etc. Also for the levirate marriage and those laws, they apply to him. Now, if you look at some of the details, it will say certain adjustments, but they are sort of minor adjustments. Yes, he participates in the rituals, but certain ones of them have to happen in a sort of amended fashion. But more or less, we could walk away with the impression that the high priest is sort of treated like every member of the Jewish people who follows halakha. Again, we're assuming this is not I don't think it's the Sadducean high priest who's rejecting all of the law. We're talking about the standard high priest or the idyllic high priest, and he is subject to the law. And we sort of wonder, I'm going to now formulate as a question, why is it important for the Mishnah to tell us all of this about the high priest if the punchline is the high priest is pretty much like any Jew who follows halakha, who follows law? Another comment, and then let's go forward. You want to add something?
I wanted to say, but why does it say Min HaMikdash Lo Yetzeh?
Very good. But I don't want to get there. That is excellent. There's a certain comment that was made. I'll just repeat for the YouTube. In the second paragraph, it says something interesting about the high priest and the temple, whether he is allowed to leave the temple or not allowed to leave the temple. It's actually fascinating. And I hope at some point we'll go back to that, but not for the opening lecture. So that's one set of questions you could ask. You could ask other questions. What are we reading here? We're reading the beginning of chapter 2 of Tractate Sanhedrin. And you could raise the question, why in Tractate Sanhedrin are we talking about the high priest? How did we get onto this topic? Now, those who have some familiarity with the Mishnah, rabbinic literature, or to go back to the Bible and the Torah, the high priest is certainly an important figure, right? He's the leader of the cult in the temple world. We certainly should dedicate ink to the high priest. And of course we do. Like where? Does anybody know where the high priest appears in Yom Kippur? Excellent example. So in Masechet Yoma, which is about Yom Kippur, one of the heroes of Masechet Yoma, who's the protagonist of the tractate dedicated to Yom Kippur? It's not the Chazan. Maybe that would be today, right? But the protagonist in the Mishnah is the high priest. Because in the temple world, the showstopper is the high priest on Yom Kippur. And if you would look in, a lot of the Mishnah is dedicated to the temple, right? Which itself is sort of fascinating. But there are tractate after tractate. A lot of us find this material a little alien, a little challenging, a little, intimidating. But if you look at those chapters and tractates, which have a lot of rich, interesting traditions in them, the high priest appears all over the place. But why is the high priest appearing in Tractate Sanhedrin? Now, to appreciate that question, we'd have to step back for a second and ask, what is the topic of Tractate Sanhedrin? We know, just to give a word of background for everybody to make sure we're on the same page, we know that the Mishnah is organized topically or thematically, right? Not so obvious, by the way. The Torah, is the Torah organized topically or thematically?
No.
Sometimes we could scratch our heads to figure out the order. That's why the Torah, our great scripture, is a challenging read also. That's why we have to repeat it every Shabbat and every year to try to master it, because it has portions that are challenging. And one of the challenges of the Torah is it skips from topic to topic. The Mishnah, in a sense, is trying to organize, right? Trying to classify. My wife is much more organized than I am. So some people, sort of go more, non sequitur. And then we're very appreciative when somebody comes along and gives a little order and organization. That's what the Mishnah really does to the halakhic topics that originate in the Torah and that rabbis start to think about. So, for example, just to give an obvious example, if you want to know what is the topic of Tractate Shabbat, well, we get it from the title. It's about the Sabbath. Now, here and there, of course, Tractate Shabbat might touch on something not Sabbath related, but the bulk of Tractate Shabbat is about the Sabbath. So what's the topic of Tractate Sanhedrin? And the answer is, well, it's about the Sanhedrin, but let's give a broader answer. It's about what? Not just the Sanhedrin. What is the Sanhedrin in modern parlance? What we call the Sanhedrin? The Supreme Court. And it's more broadly about the judicial system. So it's about the court system. And in fact, that's really a lot of Tractate Sanhedrin follows that. The first chapter is about the judicial hierarchy or the judicial pyramid, right? If you think in the US, on the federal level, you have district courts and circuit courts and a Supreme Court. That's what chapter 1 of Tractate Sanhedrin is about. Let's just maybe peek at that for a second. I'm scared a little bit to move things here, but let me try. Need help for a second? Sorry. I just want to move the PowerPoint. Okay. So here we go. If you look at chapter 1 of Tractate Sanhedrin, it tells us the judicial pyramid, the hierarchy of the courts, at least the ideal hierarchy of the courts. But by the way, notice how we're getting to political topics. Here is the design of the courts. It is, by the way, I hope to find time to elaborate about this at some point. It's an ideal, I think, design of the courts. It's not clear if this design ever was implemented exactly as described here in chapter 1. But the design of the courts, according to Sanhedrin chapter 1, is, well, we have lower civil courts, right? That's Dinei Mamonot B'Shlosha. You'll translate monetary matters are judged by 3, meaning 3 judges. Okay, then we have the intermediate court, which is Dinei Nefashot, what we'd call capital courts, are 23 judges. And then we have the Supreme Court, which is called here the Beit Din Shel Shivim Ve'achad, the Tribunal of 71. Okay, so you have 71 sages or elders or judges, and they in apparently matters of national import. And at some point we could try to parse what the matters of national import are. And then they're also called, the Court of 71, or the bottom line, they're called the Sanhedrin, or the Sanhedrin Gdolah, right? The Great Sanhedrin. It says Sanhedrin, not Sanhedrin, but by the way, the word Sanhedrin, just to point out, it's a Greek word. That's very interesting, right? It's not a biblical term. In the biblical, you never find the term Sanhedrin. It's literally a Greek word for a gathering. It's sort of like the word yeshiva. What does yeshiva mean? A sitting, a convening, like a panel that convenes and sits. That's what the word Sanhedrin means. Sanhedrin is a Greek word for the gathering, the convening of those who sit together. And that becomes the rabbinic term for the Supreme Court. So I detoured for a second just to give a little overview. What is Tractate Sanhedrin about? And the answer is that Tractate Sanhedrin is about the judiciary. Chapter 1 actually gives us the judicial hierarchy among the courts. Lower courts of 3 judges deal with civil matters. intermediate courts of 23 deal with capital matters. And then above them is a Supreme Court, a court of 71 sages. And another name for them is the Sanhedrin, the Yeshiva, the gathering, but we'll just call them the Sanhedrin, or sometimes they're called the Beit Din HaGadol, the Great Court, or sometimes they're called the Beit Din Shel Shivim Ve'echad, the Court of 71. Just a parenthetical comment, because we're trying to learn a lot of things along the way. What distinguishes, and here's again sort of a political insight, if we compare this design, let's say, to the federal court system in America today. Is it similar? Is it different? Any comments?
Well, it's sort of like New York State court system.
Okay, let's use the federal model. Let's use the federal model. Just to all be on the same page. Somebody wanted to compare it to the New York State, which is interesting. But what about the federal model? Is it similar, different? It's similar in having 3 tiers.
Yeah.
Anybody want to point out the difference?
9 versus 1.
First of all, the numbers, good. Here it goes from 3 judges to 23 judges to the highest have 71 judges. So there are more judges here. That's an interesting observation. If you think at the federal level, what do you have? You have basically in the district level, you have 1 judge. In circuit courts, often you have 3 judges. Sometimes they could sit in bank, and then you get up to like 23 judges. And then the Supreme Court, you have 9 justices. We know that's been a topic of conversation. Maybe there's a fantasy among some Democrats of changing that at this point. Probably unlikely. Just 1 second, please. So you have a difference in the numbers, okay? And you wonder, is that just a quantitative difference, or does that reflect a certain political orientation, that somehow there's a commitment to more justices or more judges being involved in administering justice, okay? This is an example of the type of a compare contrast I want us to do in our seminar or study together. We look at something, we could just read it. Oh, fact, there was 3, 23, 71. But then you're sort of invited to compare it to a design that we know, let's say in the US, and think, is it similar? Is it different? And the ways it's similar, ways it's different. Just to point out quickly, because I want to get back to where we were, another interesting difference is, what's the relationship in the US between district court, circuit court, and Supreme Court? How do you move from the lower court to the middle court to the higher court in the US?
It has to be accepted.
It has to be accepted and through and appeal. It's an appellate climb up the ladder. Okay, by and large, of course, here and there, we know the Supreme Court, there's some exceptional cases of original jurisdiction, but by and large, the Supreme Court is a court, the highest court of appeals. And the middle court, of course, we call it the Court of Appeals. Is that what's happening here? No, right? That's interesting here. It's not an appellate hierarchy. It's not an appellate ladder. The lower court deals with monetary matters. The middle court deals with capital matters. And the Supreme Court deals with other types of, let's just use the label, national matters. That's a different way of divvying up jurisdiction or responsibility of courts. And you wonder, is there any notion of supervision of the Sanhedrin over the lower courts? Is there any possibility of appeal? We don't see any of that here, and that's interesting. Now, maybe that's a vulnerability of the system, or maybe it's a different type of commitment. Well, along the way, I'm going to raise questions. I'm not always going to have the answer to all these questions, but this is the way I think we could read these texts and sort of derive more interesting, I think, insights, or at least a series of questions to think about them. So now I want to go back. Let me just hold on. Let me take the comment. Great.
What you were saying is,
yes.
But if you have a court of 3 and you have a court of 23, can you pick and choose which court you want? What's the jurisdiction? You would think that the higher court has got the, as you said, the national one, but if you're not satisfied with this court's monetary decision, can you go to the next court? Right,
that's an interesting question. The question was asked, how much is there basically forum shopping or venue selection? And how much you sort of, can you pick your courts, or do you go to certain places? The Mishnah doesn't answer those questions at all. The Talmud at some points touches on some of those questions, but let me hold off on those because I think we're in deep enough with hard questions here. I just want to read from the chat. just a couple of comments that I'm seeing, which are important to add to the excellent comments from the audience here. One is that there were no lawyers at this point in time, and that by and large is true. Our adversarial system in the US is dominated by lawyers. For a lot of people, that's good for their parnasa, and maybe it's good for society, maybe not. But this is a system that really talks about judges and litigants and not lawyers. That's interesting. At some point, we could try to explore that more. And then another comment about is it lifetime appointments or not? That's an interesting question. And that really, they never talk about that directly. But the interesting question I would ask is who does the appointing, right? In the US, we know how loaded this is, right? We know this in the last presidency under Trump and, the current presidency under Biden, literally a Supreme Court appointment on the verge of happening. So how does appointments happen? And that's an interesting question. At some point, I do have things to say about that, but we'll see if we get to that. So let me go back to the question I raised. And the question I raised was, I asked, why does Tractate Sanhedrin even talk about the high priest? The topic of Tractate Sanhedrin is the courts. I thought the high priest is the temple officiant. I thought he leads the cult. He brings sacrifices, right? He officiates at Yom Kippur. He officiates at the festivals. We're coming up to Passover in a little over a month. He has a lot of work on Passover. But what is his relationship to the judiciary? Does he have a relationship to the judiciary? Why is that discussed in this tractate? So quickly, just any thoughts on that? Yes.
I mean, you got a court of 3, you got a court of 23, you got a court of 71, then you got a court of 1, because ultimately he's the guy that pleads the case for the Jewish people on Yom Kippur. I mean,
You're calling that a court. The comment was, isn't the high
he's the
priest
guy.
on Yom Kippur in a type of sort of court with God? That's a beautiful homiletic idea. I don't know whether that's sort of nuts and bolts enough for Tractate Sanhedrin. Thoughts? One other comment, and then let's move on. Yes?
I think it's reflecting that the courts are above the high priest.
Interesting. So now the comment was that the tractate over here is making a political statement about hierarchies. I think you mean in the political sense. And the statement is, it's trying to situate the high priest in a constellation of leaders, political leaders, if you will, in a type of, I'm adding, a type of ideal political arrangement. And here we have sort of a surprising insight if we follow. I actually am very tempted to go with you on this. It's hard to prove, but I think that was what I would call sort of a stronger reading of what's going on here. We could give a sort of a weaker reading, or we could give a stronger reading. So let me say the weaker for a second, and then I'll say the stronger. The weaker reading is, well, it's about courts, and it's about jurisdiction. So maybe at some point we just have to explain who's under the jurisdiction of the courts. And the answer is everybody, but everybody even includes the high priest. The rule of law includes everybody, even the high priest. And that's why we don't introduce the high priest and just say about the high priest that he offers sacrifices. That would really be out of place here. We say about the high priest that he is eligible to judge, and he is also judge. So we're trying to situate the high priest within the jurisdiction of the court. Does the court have jurisdiction over the high priest? Can the high priest be a member of the court? That's what I would call sort of a weaker reading. I wasn't able to open up one slide here, but the slide is the Tosafos. Okay, and the Tosafos, I'll just say it outside anyway, it would have been small print. The Tosafos are also bothered by the Tosafos, just to make sure everybody's following. We're reading Mishnah. Mishnah is around the year 200 CE, at least as its redaction, at its formulation. Okay, the traditions might be much older, but it's around the year 200 CE. That's what we're reading here in the Mishnah. The Talmud goes up to around the 7th century CE, the Babylonian Talmud. And after that, we have Geonim and other commentaries. The most famous commentaries that we know are Rashi and the Tosafos from Ashkenaz and Maimonides from Sfarad, from the Spanish world. So at this point, I'm talking about 12th century, 13th century, etc. So you have the Tosafos who ask In the Talmud, there in the page, the next time I'll try to bring it, that we could see it together. But in the Talmud, the Tosafos right over here on the side, comment asks, why are we talking about the high priest? So they answer sort of a weak answer, and I'm going to circle back to what I would describe as a stronger answer. They answer, well, we're trying to explain the relationship of the high priest to the jurisdiction of the court. And they point back, we're reading chapter 2, but they point back, and my PowerPoint, it's ahead, but it's back to chapter 1. And they point to a line here. So let's read it together. It's in the 3rd paragraph. This is talking about, we saw this already, the jurisdiction of courts of 3 for civil matters, 23 for capital matters. And then the 3rd paragraph, the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin's jurisdiction. So what does the Sanhedrin have jurisdiction over? So let's read together in the 3rd bullet point. Ein danin lo et hashevet v'lo nevi hasheker v'lo et hakohen gadol ela al pi beit din shel shivim ve'echad. What does the Supreme Court have jurisdiction over? So according to what I just read, they have jurisdiction over big deal matters. But what makes it a big deal? What makes it a big deal is who is the litigant? Okay, who is the litigant? If the litigant is the tribe, an entire tribe, now we don't even know what they're talking about exactly. The tribe of Naphtali has to answer to the halakha. The entire tribe somehow needs to be summoned before judges. So that's a big deal given the nature of the litigant, right? Today, if we want to give a comparison, imagine a state. Imagine there's a legal matter involving a state. I don't know, an environmental matter where the state has an issue. We know there's an issue of state sovereignty, et cetera, and state immunity. So these are doctrines, 11th Amendment, et cetera, right? We know such things. You could have the questions of tort liability of state. So who has jurisdiction over a tribe? Answer, Sanhedrin Supreme Court. Or a Navi Sheker, that's interesting. If you have a question of a prophet, and a prophet whose prophecy is false, like in the book of Jeremiah, it's filled with Jeremiah, true prophet, and all sorts of false prophets. So if we had to arbitrate and figure out who's the false prophet and punish the false prophet, well, that's a big deal given the nature of the litigant. Even the false prophet apparently has an important standing, at least, that he has to appear in front of a Supreme Court. And then the 3rd one, which is most germane to what we're talking about, a high priest. And this really circles back to a comment we heard before. The high priest is under the rule of law, but he's the high priest. And he's a big deal, right? And if he's involved in a halachic infraction or a legal dispute, let's say he's involved in a tort matter, or God forbid, a criminal matter, and we have to do the uncomfortable thing of subpoenaing and summoning and bringing the high priest in front of the court, well, we'll bring him in front of the Sanhedrin. So it's true, the high priest is subject to the jurisdiction, the rule of law, rule of halakha, but he's subject to the rule of halakha under the watch of, under the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin of the Supreme Court. Says Tosfot, once we raise that issue, now we segue into further details about the high priest judging and being judged in chapter 2. What do you think? Are you convinced of Tosfot's answer? Kacha, I'm with you. The comment was not blown away by this Tosfot. We feel sometimes guilty making commentaries, giving grades to the Tosfot because we drink their water, as they say. But here the Tosfot, I don't know. It's not so convincing. Okay, the high priest came up, so did false prophets. We didn't go wax and elaborate on false prophets. The tribe, we didn't go off and talk about the tribe and other things, war. There are all sorts of topics here. So the high priest is mentioned. And even if we want to round out and say certain things about the high priest, how did we get into the issues of levirate marriages and releasing from levirate marriages and mourning and funerals? We seem to have veered into several random topics. So I don't know what to make of this Tosfot other than to say I hear it. I don't know. It's sort of not satisfying. So I'm tempted to go along the lines of the comment that was made here about a stronger reading of what's going on in Sanhedrin chapter 2. And that is to suggest that Sanhedrin chapter 2 actually wants to fill out our design, our constitutional design, if you will. I'll use that language loosely, not exactly constitution in the modern sense, but the idea of what is a constitution and gives us the basic charter of government. In this case, the charter, the blueprint of the ideal government, if you will, at least one rabbinic version. And that ideal government is actually headed by the courts. Okay, just to use constitutional language, it's taking Article 3 and making it Article 1. It's taking the third branch in the US and putting them up front. The judiciary is up front. In the ideal political state of the rabbis, it's headed by the judiciary. It's a certain judicial design led by the Sanhedrin. It could be that Sanhedrin's jurisdiction is narrow in certain senses, but I think symbolically it is much more than that. The courts are, it front loads the courts, it spotlights the courts, and the courts are headed by the Sanhedrin, the great council of sages. That's Sanhedrin chapter 1. If you go with that, then Sanhedrin chapter 2 is actually helping flesh out in its own in its own formulations. We have to go with it. This is not Plato, this is not Aristotle, this is not the founding fathers, but in its rhetoric, it now is turning to other leading officiants and leaders and figures like the high priest. And it's saying about the high priest on this, if we go with this idea, it's telling us about the high priest, that the high priest participates in the judiciary, but is also subject to the judiciary. And more broadly, is under the rule of law, is under the rule of halakha, right? The high priest can be summoned into court. The high priest can be asked to testify, to have testimony against the high priest. The high priest has to follow laws of yibum and chalitza, laws of levirate marriage. The high priest has to follow mourning rituals. And I would suggest, and here I'm throwing it out, it's hard to prove this, but I would suggest it's offering a selection of certain halachot and saying, even in these halachot, the high priest is governed by these halachot. And that might lead us to think, and I'm inviting you to do this for next time, why would we think the high priest maybe think about mourning laws or levirate laws, if you will? You might think the high priest is exempt from those laws, even if we have a general idea of rule of law or rule of halakha, and everybody's under the halakha, including the high priest. But these areas of halakha, maybe we would think these areas of halakha, the high priest is exempt. Maybe when it comes to marriage rituals of the high priest or mourning rituals of the high priest, we might think he differs. Comes along the Mishnah and says, no, he is subject to them too. But what I'm saying on the stronger reading is Article 1 for the rabbis, the primary institution, judiciary. And the next branch, if you will, using that loosely, that we encounter is the high priest. And basically the statement of the Mishnah on this read is the high priest, as important as he is, leader of the Kol, the most important figure on Yom Kippur, when it comes to the political hierarchy, he's number 2. Or he's, maybe we'll see, also number 2. He is under the courts, and he could even participate in the courts. I want to think about that more next time. And he's under the halakha. I'm looking at the time. I want to just make sure now to introduce the next Mishnah to get that in. And then there's the next figure, and that's maybe what you were thinking. And what about the king?
Why is the king 3?
Is king 3? By the way, I'm not sure king is 3. He's the third one we see. So don't totally.
You would think that the king would be more.
So now I want to say, okay, the comments I know, and just to repeat in YouTube, but I'm happy to see that you should be thinking, and where's the king? If we're talking about sort of the constitutional design, constellation of leaders, isn't the king there somewhere? So indeed, in chapter 2 of Sanhedrin, we now turn to the monarch. We turn to the king. And to me, this is somewhat a confirmation of the stronger reading, right? For Josephus, I don't think we could explain exactly now why we turn to the king. Except maybe once we came to the high priest, then we get to the king. But it's sort of, I don't know. That seems to be a little of a weaker explanation. We're trying to give a stronger reading. I think it's the better reading, and that is that Sanhedrin is about courts, but when we talk about courts, we're also talking about leadership and political sovereignty and the optimal modes of rule. It's Article 1 for the rabbis is the courts led by the Sanhedrin. And then we have the high priest. And now the question is, and is the king third? Or do we have to read a little more carefully to try to discern and decipher the relationship between high priest and king? So let's read a little bit about the king. Still today, let's get this in. I want to go till about another 3-4 minutes. So let's read this Mishnah. Hamelach, the king. In general, I'm going to try to go an hour, but today till we got it going, so I'm going to try to go just about an hour. Hamelach, the king, lo dan velo daninoto, lo meid velo meidinoto, lo choletz velo chotzin lishto, and then it continues, and it turns to the topic of levirate marriages, which we just started, and funerals and mourning. The same exact topics that we encountered with the high priest, but now it tells us about the king. And what does it tell us about the king? I'll just bring it here in the English just to make sure everybody's following. On top, we saw about the high priest. And what does it say about the king? It says everything we just heard about the high priest, not about the king. The king is not. The king is not. He does not judge, lo dan. He is not judged, lo daninoto. He does not testify, lo midinoto. We do not testify against him. He does not perform chalitza. We do not perform chalitza if he passes away. That's what it tells us about the king. So in a word, how do we describe the king? Let's leave the hierarchy and the political design article 1, 2, 3 for a second. Let's just focus on king and high priest. What's the relationship of king and high priest?
King special.
Now, maybe king special. I like it. King special, I'll get to that in a second. But yeah, let's get back to my question. What's the relationship of king and high priest?
The king is above the priest.
You guys are so stuck on who's above. Let's leave above for a second and below. Their relationship is,
The king.
they
can't
are opposites.
just at all.
They are opposites, right? They are opposites.
Yeah.
That's what the Mishnah, by the way, if you see it in the Hebrew, you can see it from the English here also. You feel the rhetoric of the Mishnah, right? The rabbis are not quoting a verse from the Torah here. They're not quoting scripture. These are the rabbis speaking. And they formulate in this pithy way the following statement in chapter 2. Kohen Gadol, dan danin mi'id mi'idin choletz choletzin. Melech, lo dan, lo danin. Lo meid, lo meidin. Lo choletz, lo choletzin. Or in English, we'll say, the high priest X, king not X. That's the relationship. And that in itself is fascinating. What the rabbis are telling us, if you follow just the plain reading of the Mishnah, is that the high priest and king, leading dignitaries, leading officials, are they number one? Are they two? Are they three? We'll talk more about that next time. Okay, I'm arguing today with the help of some of your comments that number one is the courts, and then 2, 3, or tied, or 3, 2, or whatever is high priest and king. But the other thing to appreciate is high priest and king have an opposite interaction, an opposite dynamic, opposite stature vis-a-vis what? Rule of law, courts, halacha, etc. And that's why some of you have commented that the high priest in a sense is ordinary and the king is extraordinary. And that's why some of you are saying the king's even above, because the king is not judged, etc. So we have to think about them more next time. Let's take one last comment and let's wrap up.
Isn't it easier to replace a high priest than to replace a king? And that's what the, I mean, if the high priest screws up in Yom Kippur,
Yeah.
We find out the hard. right? So he's easily replaced.
Right.
The king is not so.
Interesting question. The question was, before we raised the issue a little bit about appointment, who appoints judges? And you could ask the question, who appoints high priests and who appoints kings? And now the question is, and who fires them or gets rid of them, or how do they terminate their tour of duty, their tenure, which is an interesting question. And the comment was maybe the high priest is more fungible in some sense than the king. Interesting, I'm not sure, but that's an interesting comment. I mean, historically, we know some kings lasted for a few months and some lasted for many years. And I think the same is true about high priests. But you alluded to the Mishnah that the high priest doesn't do his work. We sort of assume God will clean up shop, although a lot of the Bible is if a king, doesn't do his work, God will clean up shop. So it's an interesting comment. Let me just summarize what we've seen today because we're out of time, but just 1 minute of summary. I began with just introducing the idea of politics and the relationship of biblical text and rabbinic text to politics. And we saw some texts that are fascinating that show that even early modern Western politics drew on biblical, Hebraic, rabbinic traditions. But that invites us to look at these texts and wonder what's in them. Are they interesting politically? So our subject matter is Sanhedrin chapter 2. And Sanhedrin chapter 2 begins with the high priest and then turns to the king. And we step back and ask, why this even occur? How did this become the subject matter of Tractate Sanhedrin? Isn't Tractate Sanhedrin about courts? How did it shift from courts to high priest and king? And at least we try to build up towards a sort of a stronger thesis, and that is, it's not just sort of a technical switch of topic, but rather it's making a fundamental statement about ideal leadership and power and the optimal design, Article 1 being the courts, and then it gets to high priest and king, and we have to then think more about the relationship. And the last thing we saw is the very fact that the Mishnah says everything that's true about the high priest, the opposite about the king. And we'll pick up with that next time. Thank you.
David, is this an ongoing class?
It is.
I did, it wasn't clear.
It wasn't clear. Okay, so we'll send emails. I'll look at the comments just for a second if there are any comments. I see a comment about every tribe having a court. That's a good comment. It's a little complicated. It only appears at the margins of chapter 1 of Mishnah Sanhedrin. It does appear in the Midrash Halacha on Deuteronomy in the Sifrei, and the Ramban al Torah talks about it and appears in the Talmud. But it's not so clear how that fits into chapter 1. What we just saw, courts of 323 and 71. And I'm just looking at any other comments. Okay, that's what I see now. I see a bunch of comments. You could always email me at Parkis and I'll try to answer. Just put in the heading a question about the talk.
What's your email?
I do not know offhand.
Yeah, because I tried to figure out, but there's no consistent.
So call up the synagogue.
Yeah.
Okay.
By the way, don't forget your phone.
I'm going to just around the screen.
I think we're gonna be the next day up.
Man, is it good to see you.
Nice to
But
see you.
you didn't tell me that you were getting there, because remember